joining us here today at this Early Warnings for All initiative event, bringing together a whole of society approach. So, for those of you that aren't familiar, Early Warnings for All was launched at COP 27 in 2022 by the UN Secretary General. And the idea is that every person on Earth will be prepared with early warning systems and protected by 2027. I'm Jamie Cummings. I serve as the climate change contact point for the Stakeholder Engagement Mechanism, or the SEM. We are a part of the Sendai framework in the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. And we are a group bringing together diverse stakeholders, MGOs from over 21 groups, including youth and children, women and gender, persons with disabilities, etc., to bring that community voice into disaster risk reduction. And this year, my work in DRR really became personal. So I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, in the Appalachian Mountains, and Hurricane Helene recently came through the Appalachians and wiped out much of the city. It really was very, very devastating for so many in our community, especially those on the outskirts of the town proper. And it's caused unimaginable destruction. I mean, entire parts of the city are just, you can't even recognize. They're unrecognizable what they are. And really, there was a failure of response to Hurricane Helene. So early warnings did go out. There were texts, there were some communications, but people did not evacuate. And this is partially because Asheville is a city in the mountains of western North Carolina. So it's considered a climate haven of sorts. But as we can see with climate change and the increasing frequency and intensity of events, the question becomes, is anywhere really going to be a climate haven in the future? And so how do we prepare those communities, like my community, Asheville, to be able to respond and heed those warnings and make sure that those warnings are reaching each and every one of them? So that's what we're here to discuss today. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have a wonderful group here today that bring together multiple pieces of the Early Warnings for All initiative, from the community up through the implementation arm. So I'll start here. We have Loretta Hiberg-Girdat. She is the Chief Risk Knowledge and Monitoring and of the Capacity in the Development Branch of the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. So really bringing that piece of risk knowledge and monitoring and how we bring capacity to these communities, that's what Loretta's going to bring today. So thanks for being here. Then I'll go to Gianpaolo Basalmo. He is the Director of the Infrastructure Department within the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. Thanks for being here, Gianpaolo. And then we will move to Michelle, I skipped Abraham, my bad. Abraham Nasik. Abraham is the Director General of the Ministry of Climate Change for the government of Vanuatu. So we have our, direct government representative here, especially important at the Parliamentarian Pavilion. So thanks for being here, Abraham. Then we have Michelle Higslin. She is the Executive Director for Action Aid Australia. Thanks for being here, Michelle. And then we have Marcos Concepcion Raba. He is the Executive Director of GNDR, which is the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction. So Marcos brings that community voice to the table here. So really a great range of panelists we have. So how this is going to run, I'm going to ask each of them a couple of questions. It will be a panel-style discussion, and then towards the end, we'll have time to take questions from the audience. So thank you all very much for being here today. We definitely want to hear from you towards the end. And yeah, with that, we'll jump in. So my first question is for you, Abraham. As Director General of the Ministry of Climate Change, so Vanuatu has shown really remarkable leadership in climate action. Everything from their campaign in the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, advisory opinion on climate change, to you all's work here in the UNFCCC system. And my question is, how do you see early warning systems and the Early Warning System for All initiative fitting into the broader picture of climate justice and loss and damage discussions?
The one thing when we're dealing with the loss and damage is that we have to know what we have and then how much of it was lost during a disaster. So having an early warning system over the climate space, meteorology, and also the geohazards is quite helpful for us because we're always facing disasters and we're always in a state of disaster response. So roughly in a year, we will have maybe 6 months of no disaster, and then we're into the cyclone season, which starts from 1st of November right through to 30th of April. Having an early warning system in place that's integrated into all of the communities right down, and it's part of the planning, the disaster response plans of the communities right down. It connects it connects the community with the system that's installed in the national level, whether it's the weather radar, the MET systems, and so on. Because at the national level, when you have these systems, we tend to use terminologies that are English terms. But when you're translating it right down to the communities, it has to be changed to terminologies that's understandable right down. Because otherwise you might have an English term that makes sense to us, but right down it's a different action. So for example, if I were to take tropical cyclones, so we have the three lights, blue, yellow, and red, for the 72 hours, 48 hours, and 24 hours. Because of the amount of work that we've done through mainstreaming this preparedness into the communities in their individual plannings, whether it's improving the map, how they read the map, and how they translate what actions is for blue alert, yellow alert, and red alert, that when it comes to issuing an early warning for tropical cyclone, what we do is we use all the medias that's available, social media, radio, and all that. And you send a short text, and that will just contain the location of the system, the color, and then where it's heading. And because of the color, the community, right from the national level right down, they can match the color to the actions. And then they're able to be prepared and get ready for whatever's coming their way. So this is why for us, when there's a new system that's implemented at the national level, we have to go through and assess if it will fit with the strategies that's being implemented right down, or it will create different action. So there's a whole lot of work that goes into making sure that the new technology that's being put in can be translated right down. So the same instruction that's issued national level is the same instruction that's issued provincial, area, community, and the village level. So there's a whole lot of work that's been done over many years. And every time we have a disaster response, all the improvements that we are recommended from this response get implemented to the next preparedness plan for our season, like the one we have now, is a cumulative update of all the previous experience we've had on the previous disaster response. So this time we have the current version for season 24-25. That's in place now.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. So Yeah, the element of language being brought up there. How do we take an English language and bring it down to something that makes sense to communities? And also, literacy then comes into that piece, and you're using the colors as somewhat of a code. So, yeah, really interesting to hear how you all are streamlining that from the national down to every locality. So, thank you so much for sharing. Lori, I have a question for you as Chief of Risk Knowledge at UNDRR. What are key actions undertaken for risk knowledge and management? This is pillar 1 of the Early Warnings for All initiative at the local level. Can you explain how this pillar plays out at a practical level given in any community?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you can hear. I think it's a little bit loud in here. And thank you for asking about Pillar 1. I don't know if you're all familiar with the early warning 4 pillars, but I can tell you every year that we undertake an assessment with countries on how well they're doing with early warning systems. Pillar 1 is always where we see the least amount of investment. So it's the area that we have to scale up the most, and yet we are still lagging behind. Why is that important? Because we don't necessarily know who is most vulnerable. The hazards are not remaining constant. They're very variable now, especially due to climate change. And we really need to understand better exposure. Who's exposed to these disaster events? And without that information, what happens is you get very generic forecasts that are not actually targeted to those that are most at risk. So within UNDRR, but with the whole range of partners, we are very much focused on expanding our understanding of the risk, of vulnerability, of exposure to underpin early warning systems. And without this information, communities lack the ability to empower themselves. Now, much of this information stems from within the community themselves. There's often, and we've seen through the forensics that we have carried out in post-disaster events, that those communities that are able or have understood their risks are better able to respond. We did a forensics of the Sulawesi disaster earthquake, and that was a very clear result. Communities that had experienced these risks were using the knowledge that they have acquired to inform their own populations were far better off than those communities that were relying on alerts that was sent from the national level down. So what are some of the actions that are being taken that we're trying to strengthen with very much with this focus on community? One of the first things we're aware of is that producing risk information is not enough. It has to be used. And so we have produced now, with our partners, the Chima Foundation, guidance, a handbook on the use of risk knowledge to improve early warning systems. It's not about how to produce a map. It's really geared towards the other pillars, the Met services, those that are issuing the alerts, those that are guiding local action. What is the risk information that's needed, and how do you use this? Without risk information, you can't issue impact-based forecast. And without impact-based forecasts, we know that the likelihood that the appropriate early action is taken is lessened. So there's a real need for us to see this as a cross-pillar endeavor, even if we call it Pillar 1. But what are some of the very specific things that are happening at the local level? Well, there is support going on right now, for example, for local level hazard and risk mapping to really identify at a community level the vulnerability exposure, but also to understand what is the potential impact of a hazardous event. And just to give an example, in Mozambique, risk assessments are being conducted at the community level to identify those areas that are most prone to flooding and cyclone impact. So this is resulting in mapped evacuation routes and designated safe zones. We're also partnering with local governments, NGOs, and community leaders to ensure that the risk information is both relevant and trusted. And this is very important. The information needs to be reinforced by local community leaders, by those that are trusted by the community. So, for example, in Nepal, collaboration with local leaders and NGOs helped deliver earthquake preparedness information that reflected the local building practices, but also the community concerns. The incorporation of local and indigenous knowledge is really important. And in the handbook that we have produced, every section looks at how do you better incorporate indigenous and local understanding of risk. So For example, in the Pacific Islands, traditional knowledge on ocean currents and wind patterns is being incorporated into risk assessments, complementing the scientific data for a more holistic understanding of risk. We're also looking at how do we adapt the risk communication, so the development of community maps, but also simplified reports, mobile apps. So for example, in Indonesia, a mobile app was created for fishermen that provides real-time weather alerts and risk information in the local language, as was just mentioned. And this obviously enables safer navigation practices. We're also focused on capacity building and training for local stakeholders. So this is not only for the officials, for the municipal authorities, but also the first responders at the local level. So for example, in Kenya, community-based training on flood early warning, interpretation and response is empowering local residents to know in advance where to evacuate early and to safeguard assets. We are very focused on improving data collection at the local level. We mentioned loss and damage. We are responsible for supporting countries to track losses and damages from climate and other disaster impacts down at the local level. We know that climate change is bringing about what we call high-frequency, low-intensity events. And so currently a lot of the data collection is happening at a threshold that's too high to really capture the localized events. So our work is really looking at how do we capture what's happening at the most local level. So for example, in the Philippines, what we're seeing is very good practice is the disaster loss and damage tracking system is being broken down by demographic groups, which is something that we often lack, is that disaggregated data of women, girls, boys, older people, people living with disabilities. Absolutely crucial for early warning, but often that information is lacking. We need that information down at the local level. And then some very practical tools. We have developed a disaster resilience scorecard for cities. On early warning, we have other scorecards on disability, on climate change. But on early warning, it's very specifically helping cities understand how do they score in terms of readiness and ability to put in place early warning systems. And maybe a final point I would like to mention is we are also working now with the Green Climate Fund to look at how do we train government officials to access the Green Climate Fund. There's a lot of countries, in particular countries that we are very concerned about with early warning, which are fragile contexts, countries that are fragile, conflict-affected and violent settings that are not accessing climate finance. And so we're working with these countries so that they're in a better position to access climate finance, but also to ensure that that doesn't just remain at the national level, but that it's really getting down to the local level. So I think I'll leave it there. I tried to give you some very concrete examples, but for us, risk knowledge needs to be a bottom-up exercise, starting at the local level, aggregated at the national level, a two-way communication. That's often what's lacking, and that's sometimes why we see early warning systems fail.
Thank you, Lori. Yeah, really a comprehensive answer, and you can see how much is being done by UNDRR and many others to ensure this localization of an early warning system. And I really liked the piece you brought about providing the knowledge to the community, but you don't just want to dump it on them and say, here are your future risks, good luck. You want it to be used. What do they do with that information? What policies are developed, and where do you go from there? So I want to dig a little bit more into that. And so I'll go to you, Gianpaolo, to talk a bit more about WMO. And I want to know how can we enhance the systematic observation and data sharing capacities of the Early Warnings for All initiative? So in other words, what are some key technological and data sharing innovations that could help accelerate the implementation of this initiative by 2027?
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for having me, for having WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, participating. So as you know, Early Warning for All is a flagship initiative. WMO is the UN specialized organization on weather, water and climate. And as you heard, Early Warning for All is designed on pillars. So you heard about Pillar 1, disaster risk knowledge, from my colleague on UNDRR. There is a second pillar, which is observation and forecasting, and then dissemination and communication and preparedness and response warning. So I will speak about observation and forecasting, which links really to the technology you are mentioning. What makes data available? So first of all, WMO is fostering open data policy, and this is really a big achievement. It's the resolution 1 of the WMO resolution, the open data policy, and defines core data as data that are openly shared and openly available to all countries, to all nations, and all use, public or private. The technology which underpins open data is the WMO information system. So the WMO information system historically was based on the GTS, the Global Telecommunication System. This is like that, from the 60s onwards. Where WMO is really pushing forward the innovation is moving to a new protocol which is web-based, and it's using the protocol of Internet of Things. So it's a modern protocol which is very innovative because it's not any longer based on pushing the data or pulling the data. It's event-based. So it means that the data is available as soon as the data is gathered. And also it embeds technology for avoiding what is called the single point of failure. So it's very important that the data is available through nodes, and it's available through different nodes who can really act as collector of the data. And the data quality control can be associated to that. So, but the speed at which the data becomes available thanks to the WIS2 system, so the WMO information system, is really one of these technology. So technology is one of the components. We are actively working to basically going country by country in order to improve the capacity building of using that technology. So my colleague in the WIS team are organizing workshop country by country. So this is really important to adopt the technology. What I can tell you, reporting the outcome of my colleagues, that there is a country where they run a workshop, and after that people don't use the WIS2 system. So this migration on this new modern system is really paying off. It is for weather data, but it's very flexible for water data, for hydrology data, or in future even for data for greenhouse gases or atmospheric pollution. It's a very comprehensive system in order to push data and to distribute data. So early warning for all, it's a great challenge. Basically was launched by UN Secretary General, and we are 2 years into its evolution. So there are some important progress that we can mention, and they are reposing on this infrastructure that allow the data, so the observation and the forecasting data, to reach the user of the early warning system. So the scope is really to make sure that nobody, early warning system for all should be protecting everyone on Earth with an end-to-end early warning system. This is, leave nobody behind. You will always hear that from our Secretary General, Celeste Saulo, Professor Celeste Saulo. You were mentioning things becomes personal. So our Deputy Secretary General was actually in Asheville also when the hurricane passed. So there is nobody of us who doesn't hear about an extreme event touching us or touching some close family, close friends. So it's really important that we deliver rapidly the early warning for all. So in the 2 years that have passed, we can mention that the early warnings are protecting lives in more than half of the country in the world with a multi-hazard early warning system. Those with substantial to comprehensive system have fewer disaster-affected people per capita. So this is really a clear result. 55% of countries, so 108 countries, report having some element of an early warning system in place. So also thanks to the early warning for all, we can do what you were saying. Knowing what is there is very, very important to know how the development should help, and have impact-based forecasting is extremely important to make sure that those numbers coming from forecast are actually understood from the population and generate action. So risk knowledge continues to lag behind. It's really a very, very difficult topic in order to really reach the different needs, and so there is more effort to be made. So observation and forecasting are improving, but there are large gaps remaining. So in particularly for impact-based forecasting, our forecast model are not yet covering the last mile of information and going up to impact. So what does it mean an extreme event? What does it mean a tropical cyclone in terms of action? What should I do? Should I evacuate? Should I try to protect my house? What is the action recommended associated to a forecast deliver? Momentum is building for anticipatory actions. We can classify forecasting in the range of anticipatory action. This is really important, and we have to say that plans are still not widespread. Only 1/3 of the countries report having a plan to act on early warning systems. So what do we do with it? So 1/3 of countries report having plans. What about the other 2/3? And finally, innovation and new technology brings a really opportunity to scale the multi-hazard early warning system. So improvement in the hardware, improvement in the software, improvements in the platform from data sharing, use of artificial intelligence. We hear, there's no one day that passed that we don't hear about artificial intelligence. So weather forecasting is now moving to use artificial intelligence for producing weather forecasts. And the innovation there is that the technology gap gets reduced. So early warning system or forecasting system based on AI don't need to run on supercomputers. So they can run on local technology, local computer with reduced cost. What is really becoming costly is the training data set, so availability of data. WMO will continue to foster data sharing, data availability. The Global Basic Observing Network is a key concept on which repose that UN systematic observation financing facilities. So countries can really have help from the UN SOFT in installing new observations, especially developing countries. So SOFT is helping to install the basic observing system. And there is a minimum number of stations that is associated to that. So it can be claimed to have funding in order to support the installation of those stations, measuring stations. So we are scaling up, preparing for 2030. So Early Warning for All want to deliver, what it needs to deliver is national ownership. The leadership is in the nation. We need to empower the nation. And the Early Warning for All support will leverage, the technology and the highly developed early warning system as examples to share the information and also to share the best practices. So a lot of the WMO effort is also on writing the regulatory framework, the guides and the guidelines in order how to take observation, how to use this data. So core activities across the pillars and countries needs to strengthen the end-to-end early warning system. And the technical guidance, tools and support to the implementation, this is where WMO can really help, and it's where we are proactively working in that direction. In terms of system, we have to look at the effectiveness of the system, particularly developing simulation methodology for testing the effectiveness, tools for scanning the effectiveness, and then troubleshooting and identification of priority issue to address. When there are a lot of problematics, we need to prioritize, and see what are the key elements to deliver a minimum level of early warning system. And finally, last but not least, strengthen the collaboration. We are 4 organizations supporting the early warning for all. The collaboration between the 4 organizations is very strong, but this needs to extend to incorporate the national leadership. So coordination at regional and country level is essential. Strengthen the involvement with UNRC, UNCTs is very important. Widespread stakeholder engagement, so the SEM, is fundamental. And finally, streamlining and tailoring approach. There is early warning for all, but there isn't one solution that fits all. This has to be clear that early warning has to listen to the needs country by country and tailor to the demand of the country. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Giampaolo. That was a whole host of information, really helpful to dig into the data and information bit. And yeah, we've heard really from all 3 of our first panelists that the community element is critical, and the stakeholder engagement, and making sure that these early warning systems are tailored to fit where they need to fit. So I want to talk a little more about that with you, Michelle. At ActionAid, from your experience working directly with those communities, what are the main barriers you've observed in making early warning systems truly accessible, especially to marginalized populations? And how can we maybe begin to address these challenges?
Thanks very much. Can you hear me at the back? Great. Look, first about ActionAid, we are part of a global organisation working to advance women's rights and end poverty and injustice in over 70 countries. ActionAid Australia is also part of the Shifting the Power Coalition in the Pacific. And I'd just like to acknowledge my colleague Carolyn Kitione from Shifting the Power Coalition in Fiji, where we're working together to roll out Pacific-owned, women-led early warning and response systems. And this is about really making a shift to putting communities in the driving seat of early warning. And it might sound small scale, so let me give you an idea of the reach of some of these mechanisms. In Vanuatu, Women Wetam Weta, which ActionAid leads with a team of 40 local women, is reaching 40% of the population through the Digicel network, mobile phone network. In PNG, where they've set up Mary Got Information, Mary Got Power, Women Have Information, Women Have Power, it reached more than 3.5 million people during COVID-19 with how to prevent infection, how to respond. So these aren't small systems, they're quite significant scale. So I guess what I'd like to say on barriers is that the first barrier is the assumption we make that marginalised people and women particularly don't have the capacity to lead these systems and are just purely beneficiaries of early warning messages. Definitely what we've seen in the Pacific, when we give power to women and access to climate science and information, access to technology, access to resources, communities can drive effective mechanisms that are responsive to their local needs. And I mean, I share an example with you because in Vanuatu, the Women Wetam Weta mechanism, of those 40 women, at least 10 of them are women with disabilities, and they are leading with the abilities they have. So I think that's the first thing I want to say. It's the assumptions we make. The second thing is who controls the message. Often messages assume a level of knowledge, a level of education, and they may alert people to disasters, but I think what we've found through consultations with women, what is critical is what do you actually do with that information. So one of the defining features of the work, particularly in Vanuatu, is that local women have developed messages in their local language, Bislama, but are talking about what are the practical actions that can be taken when a disaster is about to strike to protect their families, to prepare their food sources, to protect their crops, and combining some of their local Indigenous knowledge with the climate science. So I think the more we can think about how do we get control into the hands of communities is really powerful. I think the other thing I'd say is inaccessible challenges. our sisters with disability always remind us that, you know, if we send out text messages, then people who can't see don't see them. If we sound the alert, people who can't hear don't respond. And with alarming impacts. In many Pacific Islands, we've heard horrific stories about what happens when you don't receive the alert. And I think also when we concentrate too much in capital cities, highly populated areas, we miss those in remote areas. So we do have to think about how do we reach hard to reach communities, how do we reach those who don't have the same accessibility as others. I think the other issue I'd raise is sustainability. I think you touched upon this, and you know, I think until we can get some of these community systems more embedded in government mechanisms, they'll continue to be funded as pilots, as short-term projects, but how do we recognise these as legitimate parts of early warning and make sure they have the resources backed up to really sustain them in communities? And I would say as well that I think the knowledge that communities bring, the resources they bring, the networks they bring, are all an in-kind contribution that really makes these mechanisms successful. And I think less of a barrier, but more of something that we've learned over time is that when we can get community systems running alongside government, which is what we have in Vanuatu, where the Women Wetam Weta is embedded with the National Emergency Operations Centre, we can have greater impact. Government does what it does well, and the community does what it does well in terms of reaching some of those, you know, hard to reach places and getting messages out. And I guess I just wanted to wrap up by sharing, because you mentioned anticipatory action, and we've recently done a study of, I guess, the economic benefits of anticipatory action through the Vanuatu example. And this has shown every dollar that is invested in this Women Wetam Weta, the early warning mechanism, is saving $4.40 in a humanitarian crisis. So it has an economic benefit. But the added benefit is it's also supporting some of our bigger outcomes around the Sustainable Development Goals, so particularly on gender equality. So the study actually found a huge gender transformative impact by putting power into the hands of women. It is seeing changes in their roles in the community, in their households. It's triggering generational change for young women and girls. And we're also seeing that, you know, women have been able to drive shifts in some of the government policy, in access to services. So I think these kind of mechanisms have an added value of reaching communities, but also having bigger transformative impact. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. Really interesting also to hear how you're working directly with Vanuatu, bringing that element there. And I love that piece that you brought of, you know, nation-led, and women-owned, or it was the other way, nation-owned, women-led. Yeah, really, really an important piece. So thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, it's, again, to continue with this community element, Marcos, I want to turn to you. So Marcos is from Spain, for those that don't know. And as you've heard, there were devastating floods recently in Valencia, in the region. So I want to talk a little bit more about how we can bridge that gap between a high-level early warning system and local community action. And also I want you to tie in, you know, what role do networks like the SEM and like GNDR play in bridging that gap?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, for having us. Well, I think it is. I need to speak up. Okay. When we talk about early warning for all, which is brilliant, and we from SEM, the stakeholder engagement mechanism for the Sendai framework, we think that it is important to follow a similar process to really engage with all the stakeholders in implementing the early warning for all. Of course, you mentioned about the nation and the national level leading and owning the initiative, but we do think that we cannot stop there. So that's why DSM and of course GNDR is advocating for community-based early warning systems. We do think it is important to make sure that we do think it is more effective. We have experience in showing that early warning systems from the community, with the community, are much more effective, as you mentioned right now, but also more sustainable. The communities, population, they own the system itself. We have the experience at GNDR. We call this initiative Localizing Climate Projections in Tanzania, and that was basically that. That was basically bringing together academia, the meteorological office from the national level, local authorities, and of course, civil society organizations from the community, working together in understanding what the meteorological office, the national Met office was bringing, understanding with the research institutes and universities their own research, but also those making an effort and understanding and taking into account the indigenous knowledge, the local knowledge. And it was brilliant because they didn't stop there. As local authorities were there, they put together all that information, they put together all that effort, and they worked in a local plan for early warning, working on their own messages, working on their own evacuation plan, all these kind of things. So we are not just bringing knowledge, data, collecting data from all levels, but we are putting in practice that. So this is a great example of what DSEM is trying to advocate for. When we talk about community-based early warning systems, it's basically about that, making sure that it is inclusive, as you said, including all groups, women, people with disabilities, but making sure that everybody can understand and participates. As you said, I'm from Spain. You know, Valencia, we had this horrible situation a couple weeks ago. And there was resources, there was capacities, everything was in place. There wasn't coordination at all. And we had more than 200 deaths in 8 hours. So it doesn't make sense at all. We do think that this framework, inclusive framework, has to be formalized. Shouldn't be an option for the national level to include the local level. Shouldn't be an option to use it or not. When we talk about community-based early warning systems, we are advocating to formalize, to make sure that the local level participates in the decision-making. Basically, that's basically that's the idea, and that's our experience. As I said before, it is more effective and it is sustainable. This is basically what I don't want to take more time from you. Summarizing, that's basically the idea. I don't know if I...
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Marcos. So, really, thanks for those concrete examples, as well as talking about, the importance of that national coordination, but also, mandating or ensuring that the local level is heard and connected there as well. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to you all. So begin brainstorming your questions. I'm sure this has been a really thought-provoking discussion. But I'll ask one final question, and this one's a little more creative. And whoever wants to jump in, feel free. We'll just pass you the mic. But say, let's create a scenario here in Baku. Here we are, thousands of delegates. And there is a tropical cyclone incoming from the Caspian Sea. So we are here, and it's imminent. We have 48 hours, say. What are you going to do right here, right now, in the COP 29 arena. What messaging will you spread? How will you spread it? Think about all the different nationalities, all the different people with abilities, varying abilities, differing genders, etc. You know, how do we communicate this risk and then the action that they take? Happy to hear from any of you on your thoughts there.
So it's a very important question what you're asking. So you're asking the question, you know, what is something completely unforeseen and unlikely? You know, tropical cyclone coming from the Caspian Sea. We have to prepare for the unforeseen, and this is really the elephant in the room. Climate change is such a dramatic effect that none of the early warning system that we have right now can face the future of climate change. It was emblematic what you were saying about Valencia. Valencia has a lot of infrastructure, as radar, as you know, as a forecasting system. It has a lot of people dedicated, and yet if you have 1 year worth of rain in one day, it's very, very difficult to be prepared for that. So the preparedness or the anticipatory reaction has to face climate change. It was not more than 2 days that the attribution science has said that Valencia extreme event was made more extreme by climate change. The science community was very quick to say that climate change is the component. So in the case, for the question you said, you ask, what do? We have to go, make sure that the communication of the extremes is tailored to the diversity that we have here at COP. The language, first of all, adapting to the language. It was mentioned by our colleague from Vanuatu. The terms we use in English maybe don't mean exactly the same. They need to be adapted to the local language in order to project the level of risk and the level of reaction that people should have. So it's a problem of being able to reach out, being able to generate an action consequent to the risk. So and this is really one element. The other element is how to basically engage in raising the attention. People tend to act based on their own experience. A lot of people say, "Oh, I've seen a lot of bad storm from the Caspian Sea. We will be okay. We built a very, very solid COP29, so we will face whatever comes." So the interpretation of risk, the generation of action that is consequent to the risk is really a communication challenge, and there's only so much that the technology can do. The rest is really pillar one, educate about the risk, and pillar three, I think, communication and the preparedness. Making sure that this kind of event is in the planning of the cities, for instance, that the city infrastructure can withstand extreme events. This is a call for every city now, because every city is proofing for climate change. One big example, one thing that everybody of us is experiencing over summer is extreme heat. So extreme heat is the #1 killer. Even if we have extreme events like flooding, they really are terrible. But if you look at the casualties from extreme heat, it's really an apocalypse. So it's really a lot of casualty. Very difficult to diagnose, actually.
Thank you, Gianpaolo.
Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. Great to hear your thoughts. And yeah, who knows? Maybe a tropical cyclone could develop in the next little bit. Yeah, Lori, come on in.
So yeah, I agree with you. The hazards are changing. I don't know if we'll get a tropical cyclone, but in any case, they are changing. But I want to maybe focus on a few points around the messaging, because what we are trying to do as part of Early Warnings for All, Over the last 2 years, we've been very much focused on helping countries understand which capacity gaps they have. And now we're turning our attention to really helping them understand the effectiveness of their systems. And we're developing a methodology for after-event reviews, so after-action type of methodologies to what went wrong, essentially, but also to conduct simulations so that you can really test the system. So even if you had all the elements in place in something like the tragedy that happened in Spain, something went wrong in the system, and really trying to understand what that was is critical for improving the systems. But just to give you some insight into the forensics that we have done on past events, it's often around the messaging where you see the breakdown in the system. And you will remember a few years ago the floods in Germany, which also resulted in a high level of casualties. The issue there wasn't that there were not messages, is that there were so many messages and they were being sent and they contradicted each other and they were not clear. Typhoon Haiyan a few years ago, the messaging was very difficult to interpret. You know, people cannot understand what the wind speed or velocity means. So you really have to make the message very clear and in language that's truly understandable. The other thing we saw, Libya, the example of Libya, where the dam burst after a storm there. They didn't know which action to take. It wasn't clear which action to take. Back to Germany, in one of the messages, they were given 16 different options of actions to take. So a lot of this is really down to being extremely clear. The last thing I'd want to see is having many different people giving many different messages to this COP event on what they should do. So you really need a governance structure in place with true clarity on who is responsible for doing what. And then maybe a final point is really trying to understand who is most vulnerable in this context. Who would be least likely to be able to evacuate? Who are those that have disabilities? Where are the older people? Are there children? Having that level of granularity in terms of vulnerability would really be important to save lives.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, Marcos, go ahead and
just
quick.
one thing. I mean, in our experience in the humanitarian sector, you don't improvise in crisis. So that's, again, let's go back to the planning. Let's go back to the preparations, and let's do that all together. Again, we cannot impose top-down with our English language to local communities. So that's one point. And talking about the message, now we live in a different world. We all have a mobile phone, yes, but we don't watch TV, kids or ourselves, we watch YouTube. And influencers are spreading out the early warning from whatever source, and that is missing. That is disinformation, and that is one aspect that we need to make sure. I was amazed with one of our members in Nepal training kids in the schools. That's a national program for earthquakes. Why don't we do that in Spain, in Austria, Germany? Should be part of the education. And again, you have to engage teachers, you have to engage families, whole of society approach. That's what I mean. That's one aspect. Well, yeah, that was it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Marcos. Okay, we have time for just a couple of quick questions. Thanks for indulging me in that activity. But yeah, let's hear from our audience. Would anyone like to ask our panelists a question? I'll bring you the mic. Yeah, here you are.
So my name is Rifat. I'm from Practical Action Bangladesh. So just to give you a very brief about what is happening in Bangladesh. This year we had a super cyclone, and we had like a heat wave as well. And also we had the massive flash flood, if you can see. So it's a multi-hazard scenario in Bangladesh is happening right now. So do you really think that, and that's also like leading us to like having like cascading risk, which is like making people like unemployed and also hitting the livelihoods and the destruction of their houses as well. So do you really think that that can lead up to like any creating any food insecurity to the people, and how do you think early warning system like help with like mitigating the cascading risk and making people like to have food secured?
Thanks. That's a great question. So, early warnings and cascading risk. Michelle, you
I
want
mean,
to
I'm
take this?
happy to take it on. I mean, I think the approach that we have is you need to look at comprehensive programming, not a standalone early warning system that's there without actually being embedded in a broader initiative. I think I said the R was response systems. It's actually resilience systems, because part of it is actually trying to build community resilience, looking at ways also. Women aren't just leading early warning, but they're also leading efforts to build that resilience, because, yes, we know the bigger challenge is how do communities sustain increasing disasters and droughts. So I think it's about a comprehensive approach.
Thanks, Michelle.
One of the approach that Vanuatu is taking is that through one project that's called Fankirap, we're creating climate products for the different sectors, for food security, fishing, infrastructure development, and all that. So depending on which sector, the team with the meteorology, they develop the climate relevant product to inform that particular sector on what they need to do for food security, for fisheries, and all that. So we use the climate system to inform the different sectors to help them with the service delivery they're doing through the different departments. So this way it improves the types of agriculture non-food items that is being given out, whether it's the seedlings, cuttings, and all that. And it also helps the farmers to know when to be able to plant certain types of crops for drought, for flood resistant, and also when we're putting in infrastructure, it's multi-hazard risk informed. So it's built because, I mean, multiple islands. We don't have one island. We have like 83 islands, so everything has to be able to be replicated. So this is one project that is ongoing now for quite a few years now, and we're really moving into that, and that's something that we will also be, right now, the team is going to be looking at also creating a climate product for the health sector to help with informing the health team with regards to the sentinel monitoring the diseases, so they can see when there's a lot of waterborne diseases, cold and flu and all that, so they can map it as well. So these are some of the things that we're doing with our climate scientist team, and then to help the sectors to improve their service delivery as we try to map the social adaptive mapping of the population to the service delivery that the government needs to provide to every single island where people are. So this is something that we're doing to help with the resilience. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Abraham. Thanks, Michelle, for those, and thanks for that important question. Nice to hear the multi-sectoral integrated approach. We'll take one more, and then unfortunately we do have to wrap on the session. This was really interesting, though. Thanks.
My name is Gloria Bolu. So, particularly, you made a statement that none of the early warning system can face the future. And I think I will want to agree with you on that, that none of the, I mean, looking at the impacts of climate change and other disasters, like globally, and particularly, I mean, from my country, where I come from, I can actually tell that there's quite a lot happening. From the north, where we're having desertification and drought, to the Niger Delta region, where we're having floods and all sorts happening. I mean, so what could be done if the early warnings, I mean, we're moving at already the reports are there, ICPC have made, I mean, the alarm has already been sounded. So what can be done if the early warning system cannot sustain what is on ground, and then looking at the future? Thank you.
Anyone? Gianpaolo?
I think I can start. I think one direction is to build resilience for what is about to come. So, and integrating not only weather forecasting, but also, seasonal forecasting, for instance, is becoming very, very useful to anticipate what's going to happen with regards, for instance, to food security. Seasonal forecasting is gaining a lot of credibility. Going beyond, the climate projections, there's a lot of climate projections which are now going into focus area by area, try to predict what's going to be the challenges ahead. And for some of these changes, there is need to really upgrade the infrastructure. Not only the infrastructure of early warning for all, but the infrastructure really of cities, of the way we produce, the way we do our own activities. So, but by all means, we have to realize that early warning system will have to chase the fact that climate is changing, and therefore we need to step up the game of the type of event we will experience, the type of extremes. They are fueled by a warming climate, and that's really what's determining the intensity of events like Valencia. There was a huge anomaly from the sea was too warm, and it's a weather storm arriving with cold air was able to really extract a lot of moisture and dump 1 year of water in 8 hours. It's something people has never seen before, and the infrastructure of the city could not take that. It's independently of what the early warning system could do to alert the population. So there's a lot of planning that needs to be happening, taking into account the different information horizon, the weather forecast, the seasonal forecast, the climate projection. So it's a whole of a society approach, and that's really, the beauty of this section. There is a range of data products that have to enter into action, and the longer term needs planning. It's to be prepared for future events.
Yeah, Marcos had one thing. Go
Using
ahead.
again the example of Valencia, the Met Office sent the red light at 7 in the morning. The early warning was sent to the population 8 at night. So it was more than 12 hours between the great job of the Met Office, until the people got the message. So that was the big issue. That's the coordination. What I was going to add in that sense, there are technological developments, and I think we have them, or we are still developing, but they're pretty sophisticated and pretty good. What happened in Valencia as well, that the former course of the river used to have trees to stop the speed of the water. That disappeared. So there are a lot of nature-based solutions that we should put in place. If we just trust in technology, for sure, we're gonna miss one of the main elements, which is nature itself. I don't know. And yeah, we're gonna have to get used to the word unprecedented. Yeah, it seems like it's gonna happen, and we are gonna hear that for a very long time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our panelists. I really appreciate you all being here today. I think that this was a really wonderful conversation, bringing community voice, bringing government voice, bringing UN, multilateral, the implementers of these pillars of early warnings to the stage. So I think we had a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate you all's question and participation. We had a full house, so that's really wonderful and shows, just how important this conversation is. So thanks for being here today, and one more round for our panelists. Thank you all.